Episode 11, The Trustee Decision-Making Process. Hello, my name is Alexander von der Fellen, and welcome to Trusts Unpacked, a series of podcasts where we strip away myth and marketing and explain in plain, practical terms how trusts actually work for real families. For the past 20 years, my fiduciary work has focused almost entirely on the architecture of trusts, the skill of trusteeship, and the challenge of long-term family governance, not as a technical exercise, but as a human one. In doing so, I have had the privilege to advise hundreds of families, as well as institutions and advisors across the world. Alongside my advisory work, I'm a published author. In 2025, I completed the last in a trilogy of books on trustee skills, family stewardship, and private banking that give an inside account of how wealth, power, and responsibility are really handled behind closed doors. Before we begin, a brief but important note. This podcast is provided for general information and discussion only. It does not constitute legal, tax, fiduciary, or professional advice, and it should not be relied upon as such. As ever, you should always seek advice from appropriately qualified professionals in your relevant jurisdiction before making decisions or taking action. Now, we've just finished a group of episodes dealing with roles, settlors, trustees, beneficiaries. Today, we move on to a group of episodes dealing with decision-making, governance, and administration, and focused on the moment where all of those roles' interests collide, the decision. Most trust disputes don't arise because trustees lacked power. They arise because decisions were made badly, or more often, because they were made carelessly, inconsistently, or without defensible process. This session is about how trustees should approach decisions in practice, not perfectly, but defensibly and consistently. You see, in trusteeship, judgment is the job. So let's focus on why decision-making matters more than outcome. Trust law is surprisingly forgiving about outcomes. It's far less forgiving about process. This actually runs counter to instinct. Most people judge decisions by results. Trust law, however, judges decisions by how they were made. Courts understand uncertainty. They understand hindsight bias. They understand that trustees operate without perfect information. What courts do not tolerate, however, is failure to think, failure to engage, or failure to exercise judgment. This is why trustees who focus solely on getting it right often expose themselves more than those who focus on doing it properly. Good trustees understand this instinctively. They worry less about whether a decision will please everyone and more about whether it will withstand scrutiny later. Let me illustrate this with a case from my book Trust that on the surface looks eccentric, but in practice captures discretion perfectly. When I was starting out as a trustee, I became trustee of a testamentary trust, created by an Italian nobleman. I'd met him while I was working at Barings, and we had got on well. He had no children, no spouse, and very little interest in what would normally be described as legacy planning. What he did care about were 3 horses. 3 aging Sardinian stallions he had bred and kept on his estate for decades. The Triumph Trust was very precise in its drafting. The horses were to remain on the estate. They were to be cared for by the same groom who had always looked after them. Their feed, tack, and veterinary care were specified in extraordinary detail. Even the provenance of the hay was underlined. It wasn't sentimentality, it was fidelity. On his death, everything worked exactly as intended. The trust was funded, the horses were cared for. The routines continued uninterrupted. On paper, the trustee's role looked mechanical. Then a letter arrived. It was from the groom's son, a serious, modest young man. He had been accepted to study veterinary medicine in Bologna. His tuition was covered by scholarships. What he lacked was support for living expenses. He wrote carefully, without expectation, explaining that his intention was to qualify and return to care for the horses properly in the years ahead. Now, the trustee said nothing about education, nothing about succession, nothing about funding people rather than animals. So the question was not whether I had the power to help, I did. The question was whether I should. This is where discretion and judgment become real, not as a freedom, but as a responsibility. I asked myself what was relevant and what was not. The trust was not a bursary, but nor was it blind to continuity. The settler's intent, read properly, was not simply about keeping 3 horses alive. It was about preserving a way of care, a rhythm, a dignity. The groom would have mattered to him. The knowledge would have mattered. Stability would have mattered. Funding the son's living expenses did not contradict that purpose. It arguably served it. I also considered another risk. This would set a precedent. Once discretion is exercised, expectation follows. So restraint mattered as much as compassion. The support would be limited, transparent, recorded, and clearly linked to the trust's purpose. I approved the support, not because the trust required it, but because the trust allowed it, and because the decision could be justified calmly and coherently against the settler's intent. Years later, the son qualified, returned, and indeed took over the care of the horses. When the last stallion eventually died, the trust concluded exactly as planned, with an annuity for the groom. There was no dispute, no challenge, no noise. That outcome mattered less than the process that led to it. It wasn't a clever decision, it wasn't dramatic, but it was defensible. And that is the standard trustees are held to. Discretion lives in those moments where the trust deed runs out, but responsibility does not. So what is the nature of trustee judgment? Trustee decision-making is not a technical optimization. It is judgment under uncertainty. Now, this is uncomfortable for many people, particularly those who come from professions where rules, checklists, or formulae dominate. Trustees are not applying algorithms, however. They are weighing competing considerations, need versus preservation, present versus future, individual circumstances versus collective fairness. There is rarely a single correct answer. There is often a range of reasonable ones. The trustee's role is therefore to choose one of those reasonable options and to be able to explain why. This is why trusteeship cannot be reduced to administration. Administration supports decision-making. It does not replace it. A trustee who avoids decisions in the hope of avoiding criticism usually creates greater risk. Inaction is, after all, in itself a decision, and often a poor one. Maybe because information is incomplete, motives are mixed, outcomes are unknowable. But trustees who wait for certainty usually, as in life, wait forever. This is why trusteeship favors people who are comfortable deciding without closure. That comfort is not arrogance, it's acceptance of responsibility. Many trustees struggle here, particularly those with professional backgrounds in law or finance, where risk is often managed by deferral or qualification. Trustees, however, do not have that luxury. If a power exists, it must eventually be exercised. If a discretion exists, it must eventually be used. Avoidance is not neutrality, it is abdication, and courts are very alive to this. A trustee who repeatedly defers decisions without reason is not protected by caution. They are exposed by inertia. Good trustees, on the other hand, recognize when enough information has been gathered. They don't seek perfect knowledge. They seek sufficient understanding. And that distinction is critical. Now let's look at the elements of a proper trustee decision. It almost always involves 4 core elements. It's also worth recognizing that trustee decisions are rarely binary. They're often framed that way by beneficiaries, yes or no, approve or refuse, fund or decline. But trustees often have more options than they realize. They can approve in stages, attach conditions to approval, request further information, defer for a defined purpose, or propose alternatives. This flexibility is not evasion, it is judgment. For example, a trustee faced with a large capital request is not limited to approval or rejection. They might approve a smaller amount. They might link funding to milestones. They might require co-investment or external validation. These approaches demonstrate engagement without capitulation. They also demonstrate that discretion is being exercised thoughtfully. Now, beneficiaries may not like these outcomes, of course, but courts respect them. Rigid thinking is often a sign of trustee discomfort rather than legal necessity. So, let's go to those 4 core elements. Number 1, understanding the power being exercised. So, before anything else, trustees must understand what power they are exercising, not what they assume they can do, not what they've always done, but what the trust deed actually permits. This includes the source of the power, any conditions attached to it, and any limitations on its use. And many trustee errors begin right here. Assumptions are made. Precedents are followed blindly. Powers are exercised out of habit rather than reference. And a trustee who cannot identify the precise power they're using is already exposed. Factor number 2, identifying relevant considerations. Once the power is clear, trustees must identify what matters. This typically includes the purpose of the trust, the financial position of the trust, the needs and circumstances of beneficiaries, any stated wishes from the settlor, and the impact on other beneficiaries. Relevance is contextual. What matters in one decision may be irrelevant in another. The skill lies in recognizing which factors genuinely bear on the decision at hand. Now, the third factor I like to call excluding irrelevant considerations. This is, again, where many trustees stumble. Irrelevant considerations often feel compelling. Family pressure, fear of complaint, personal sympathy, desire for harmony, reputational anxiety. Now, sadly, none of these are legitimate reasons for exercising a power. They may explain behavior, but they don't justify it. So trustees must be alert to their own motivations. A decision driven by fear of conflict is not neutral, it's biased. Now, the fourth judgment I like to call exercising judgment in good faith. So trustees must actually decide, not defer indefinitely, not delegate responsibility, not hide behind advisors. Judgment means choosing, knowing that someone may be disappointed. This is the hardest part of trusteeship and the most unavoidable. So now let's look at information, evidence, and, shall we say, proportionality. Good decisions are grounded in evidence. That doesn't mean exhaustive analysis. It means sufficient understanding. Trustees should ask, do we have current financial information? Do we understand the beneficiary's position? Do we understand the implications for the trust as a whole? Have we taken advice where appropriate? The standard is not perfection. It's plain reasonableness. The level of inquiry should be proportionate to the size of the decision, the risk involved, and the potential impact. A modest distribution does not require forensic analysis. A transformative decision probably does. Advice plays an important role here, but advice is not a shield. Trustees cannot outsource judgment. They must evaluate advice critically. Is it relevant? Is it current? Does it address the actual decision? Following advice blindly is not diligence. It is abdication. Ignoring advice entirely can be reckless. The balance is engagement. Now, discretion is often misunderstood as a kind of freedom to choose. But you see, that's wrong. In reality, discretion is constrained choice. Trustees must consider all eligible beneficiaries, even if they ultimately favor one. They must avoid rigid policies that turn discretion into entitlement. For example, Always distributing equally may feel fair, but it may also be a failure of discretion. Similarly, always saying no to avoid controversy is not neutrality, it's abdication. Discretion requires engagement. It requires trustees to confront differences, different needs, different capacities, different timing. Trustees who retreat into formulaic behavior often do so to protect themselves emotionally. Ironically, this behavior often increases legal risk exponentially. Group decision-making introduces another layer of complexity. Many trusts are administered by multiple trustees. This is intended as a safeguard, and it often is. But group dynamics can distort decision-making if left unmanaged. Dominant personalities may steer outcomes. The quieter trustees may defer. Consensus may be mistaken for correctness. Good trustee boards recognize this risk. They create space for disagreement. They invite challenge. They resist premature consensus. The absence of dissent is not evidence of good decision-making. It may simply be evidence of suppression. Courts are not interested in whether trustees agreed unanimously. They're interested in whether each trustee exercised independent judgment. A trustee who simply goes along with others without engagement is not protected by numbers. Collective responsibility does not erase individual duty. This is why minutes matter. They should reflect consideration, not just outcome. So how do trustees manage pressure and influence? Because trustee decisions are rarely made in calm conditions, pressure is constant. Beneficiaries advocate for themselves. Settlors express preferences. Advisors warn of risk. Family dynamics intrude. Well, good trustees recognize pressure without capitulating to it. They create distance. Not emotional distance, but procedural distance. They slow decisions. They formalize discussions. They insist on documentation. That's not obstruction, it's governance. Trustees who decide quickly under pressure often regret it later. Not because the decision was wrong, but because it was not defensible. Part of being defensible means recording decisions. And it's one of the simplest and most overlooked disciplines in trusteeship. Not recording verbatim transcripts, not legal essays, but clear, contemporaneous notes. What power was exercised? What factors were considered? What advice was taken? Why the decision was reached? These records are not written for beneficiaries. They're written for future trustees, advisors, courts, and trustees themselves. There's also a subtle but important distinction between explanation and justification. Trustees are often tempted to justify decisions emotionally, to explain why a beneficiary did not deserve support or why another needed it more. This language is dangerous. Trustees don't sit in moral judgment of beneficiaries. They sit in fiduciary judgment. Good records focus on factors, not character. Financial position, trust purpose, long-term impact, proportionality. They avoid personal language. This protects trustees, but it also protects beneficiaries. Explanations framed in structural terms are harder to attack and less likely to inflame. Justifications framed in personal terms, however, often become the spark for dispute. Memory fades, people change, narratives evolve. A well-recorded decision often resolves disputes before they even begin. Silence in the records, however, is dangerous. Explicit reasoning is protected. Let's turn to patterns. Because trustee decisions do not exist in isolation. They form patterns. Beneficiaries notice patterns. Courts notice patterns. Regulators notice patterns. Inconsistency is not always wrong, but unexplained inconsistency is risky. Good trustees periodically step back and review how decisions are being made, whether discretion is being exercised genuinely, and whether the trust is still aligned with its purpose. This reflective discipline is rare, and because of that, it is invaluable. One of the most effective ways trustees protect themselves is by thinking in patterns rather than events. Individual decisions rarely cause disputes. Patterns do. Repeated generosity, followed by sudden restraint. Repeated refusals without explanation. Support for one branch of a family, but not another. None of these patterns are necessarily wrong, but they must be intelligent. Trustees who periodically review their own decision history often discover inconsistencies they did not intend. It's not failure, it's inherently human. But the act of review allows trustees to correct course before beneficiaries do it for them. It also allows trustees to articulate internally what they are actually trying to achieve. Many trusts drift because trustees never pause to ask, what kind of trust are we administering now? Not originally, now. You see, trust purpose is not static. Circumstances evolve, needs change, assets fluctuate. Trustees who adapt thoughtfully tend to maintain legitimacy. Those who rely on historical precedent often lose it. This reflective discipline is rare, I grant you, but it is one of the strongest indications of competent trusteeship. Let's look at a real-world example. Consider a request for capital to start a business. Poor process would say yes because the beneficiary is persuasive, or no because it feels risky. A good process asks, is this within our powers? How does this align with the trust's purpose? What is the beneficiary's track record? What alternatives exist? What impact does this have on others? Now, the income may still be yes or no, but the decision will stand. The same applies to housing requests, education funding, lifestyle support, extraordinary expenditure. The question is never simply, should we do this? It is, how do we decide whether to do this? Let me turn to when decisions are challenged. Because challenges usually arise not from decisions themselves, but from how they are handled. It could be poor communication, inconsistent process, unclear reasoning. Trustees who can demonstrate engagement, proportionality, and good faith are far better protected. Trustees who cannot often find themselves defending not just a decision, but their entire approach. This is exhausting and often avoidable. Now, up to this point, we focused on structure, powers, process, evidence, documentation. But trustee decision-making is not purely structural. It's also psychological. Trustees are human. After all, they carry bias, instinct, fatigue, preference into every discussion. The law assumes this. It doesn't expect perfection. It expects awareness. There are recurring psychological traps in trusteeship. The first is anchoring. The first distribution often becomes the reference point for all future ones. The first valuation becomes the benchmark. The first refusal becomes the emotional baseline. Trustees must ask themselves, are we deciding this case on its own merits, or are we unconsciously anchored to what we did before? The second trap is familiarity bias. Trustees naturally feel more comfortable with beneficiaries they know well. Conversations flow more easily. Information feels more reliable. Now, this comfort can distort neutrality. A trustee may ask deeper questions of a distant beneficiary while accepting surface explanations from a familiar one. The imbalance is subtle. The consequences are not. The third trap is escalation of commitment. Once trustees have supported a particular course of action, it becomes harder to withdraw. A business venture that received seed capital may attract further funding, not because the case remains strong, but because admitting the initial decision was optimistic feels, uncomfortable. Good trustees distinguish between consistency and stubbornness. The fourth trap is avoidance. Some decisions are emotionally charged. Trustees may delay them in the hope that circumstances will resolve themselves, and they rarely do. Delay often magnifies pressure rather than reducing it. The discipline required here is simple but demanding. Pause, name the bias, test the reasoning, then decide. This internal conversation rarely appears in minutes, but it should appear in the quality of discussion. Trustees who understand their own psychological tendencies are less likely to be governed by them. But let's deal with time horizons and intergenerational thinking. This is because trustees' decisions are rarely about today alone. They are about trajectories. A distribution may relieve immediate pressure whilst creating long-term dependency. A refusal may cause short-term frustration whilst reinforcing long-term responsibility. Trustees must constantly shift between time horizons. What does the decision mean now? What does it signal for the next 5 years? What behavior are we reinforcing? This is particularly important in discretionary trusts with younger beneficiaries. If every request is met swiftly and generously, the trust becomes a mere liquidity provider rather than a governance structure. If every request is refused rigidly, the trust becomes adversarial. Neither outcome is desirable. A trustee's task is calibration, support aligned with growth, restraint aligned with purpose. And this requires thinking in patterns rather than transactions. It also requires courage, because beneficiaries rarely frame requests in terms of long-term behavioral impact. They frame them in terms of present need. Trustees must hold both perspectives simultaneously. Intergenerational trusts introduce an additional layer. A decision favoring one generation may constrain another. Capital distributed today may reduce resilience tomorrow. Investment risk tolerated now may benefit future beneficiaries disproportionately. Sadly, there's no magic formula for balancing these interests. There is only judgment. But judgment must be informed by explicit recognition of the trust's temporal dimension. Trustees who think only in annual cycles often erode long-term integrity. Let's look at conflicts of interest, because conflicts are not always dramatic. They're often almost imperceptible. A trustee who is a family friend, a trustee who benefits from advisory relationships linked to the trust's investments, a trustee who anticipates future appointment by a particular beneficiary. None of these situations automatically invalidate decision-making, but they do require disclosure and management. The law doesn't prohibit trustees from having interests. It just prohibits them from allowing those interests to distort judgment. Even perceived conflicts can undermine legitimacy. A beneficiary who believes a decision was influenced by undisclosed considerations will challenge not only that decision, but the whole trustee's credibility. Transparency is therefore protected. Disclosure in minutes. Recusal where appropriate. Independent advice where necessary. The absence of scandal is not evidence of integrity. Clarity of process is. Subtle influence is equally dangerous. Settlors who remain vocal, advisors who imply reputational consequences, family members who frame requests as some kind of moral obligation. Trustees must identify influence without hostility. A calm statement is often sufficient. We have noted your views. We will consider them within our duties and then proceed independently. Trustees who feel compelled to satisfy influence lose authority incrementally. There's also an aspect called decision fatigue. After all, trust administration can be relentless. Requests arrive unpredictably, information flows continuously, pressure accumulates, decision fatigue is real. As fatigue increases, shortcuts appear attractive, relying on precedent rather than fresh analysis, delegating more than is prudent, avoiding difficult conversations. Trustees and trustee boards must manage their own capacity deliberately. Structured agendas, clear briefing materials, defined decision points, adequate time for reflection. The quality of your decision often reflects the conditions under which it was made. A rushed meeting at the end of the long day rarely produces the same depth of reasoning as a focused session with prepared analysis. Experienced trustees normally understand this. Inexperienced ones can sometimes underestimate. Capacity planning is not indulgence, it's governance. How a decision is communicated after often determines how it is received. Trustees are not obliged to justify outcomes exhaustively, but tone does matter, clarity matters, consistency matters. A refusal delivered abruptly may provoke escalation. A refusal explained structurally may preserve respect. For example, after careful consideration of the trust's purpose, the financial position of the fund, and the needs of the wider beneficiary class, we have decided not to approve this request at this time. This language focuses on framework. It avoids personal judgment. It avoids moral commentary. It reinforces that discretion was exercised. Communication should not invite negotiation unless negotiation is intended. Ambiguity invites challenge. Clarity closes loops. Trustees must also resist the temptation to over-explain. Excessive detail can create new points of contention. Sufficiency is the standard, not persuasion. There's another aspect called institutional memory. And let me explain this in this way. Trustees change, advisors change, beneficiaries change. Institutional memory fades. A disciplined trustee board periodically reviews significant decisions, not to relitigate them, but to understand their cumulative impact. Are patterns emerging? Is discretion narrowing unconsciously? Has the trust drifted from its purpose? This reflective exercise should be deliberate. Annual review of major distributions, periodic reconsideration of investment risk appetite, assessment of communication of this effectiveness. The aim is coherence. Without review, drift becomes almost inevitable. With review, adjustment becomes possible. Documentation supports this process. Minutes that capture reasoning allow future trustees to understand context. Absent records create narrative vacuum, which beneficiaries may fill with suspicion. Institutional memory is not nostalgia, it's continuity of reasoning. Let's look at ethical courage in trusteeship. There will be moments when trustees know the correct decision will be unpopular, funding one beneficiary disproportionately due to genuine need, refusing a charismatic but imprudent request, resisting secular pressure. These moments can define an entire trusteeship. Ethical courage is not loud, it's a calm persistence in the face of discomfort. Trustees who always seek universal approval will fail in their duties. Trustees who accept discomfort as part of the role tend to endure. Courage is easier when process is clear, when reasoning is documented, when decisions align with articulated purpose. Uncertainty remains, but defensibility strengthens confidence. Let's turn to the discipline of consistency. Consistency does not mean identical outcomes. It means consistent reasoning. Beneficiaries observe patterns closely. They notice when tone shifts, when explanations vary, when thresholds appear inconsistent. Trustees who articulate internally what fairness means in the context of their trust tend to behave far more predictably. Predictability does not eliminate disagreement, but it does reduce suspicion. The most stable trusts are rarely those with the most generous distributions. They are those with the most coherent, consistent process. It's now worth addressing explicitly what happens when trustees themselves cannot reach alignment. Disagreement is not a failure. It's actually often evidence that the issues have been taken seriously. But unmanaged disagreement is dangerous. Where there are multiple trustees, each must exercise independent judgment. Doesn't mean stubbornness, it means engagement. A trustee who simply defers to the most experienced voice has not discharged their duty, nor has the trustee who dominates discussion without inviting challenge. Healthy disagreement follows a structure. First, clarify the power being exercised. Second, articulate the competing considerations. Third, test each proposed course of action against trust purpose and proportionality. When trustees disagree, the discussion should return to principle rather than personality. What outcome best aligns with the purpose of the trust? What risks are we ready to accept? What precedent are we ready to create? In some cases, external advice may assist, not to decide for the trustees, but to illuminate blind spots. Independent counsel can help clarify whether disagreement reflects genuine legal uncertainty or simply different risk appetites. Where unanimity is required by the deed, trustees must continue deliberation until alignment is reached or one trustee steps aside. Resignation is sometimes the most responsible act if a trustee fundamentally cannot support a decision that others consider proper. Where majority decision-making is permitted, minority dissent should still be recorded. A dissenting trustee who has engaged thoughtfully and expressed their reasoning is protected. Silence is far more dangerous than disagreement. The aim is not forced harmony, it's integrity of process. Not all consequences of decisions are immediate. There is an aftermath of a difficult decision. Sometimes the real impact of a trustee decision emerges months or even years later. A beneficiary who appeared grateful slowly becomes resentful. A funded business struggles. Family dynamics shift. Trustees must resist retrospective self-criticism based solely on outcome. The correct question is not, did this succeed? It is, did we decide properly at the time? Hindsight is indeed seductive. It rewrites memory. It exaggerates foreseeability. Courts understand this. Trustees must understand it too. At the same time, trustees should remain open to learning. If a decision produces unexpected consequences, that doesn't invalidate it, but it may inform future calibration. Good trustees ask, what did we miss? Not to assign blame, but to refine judgment. The discipline of periodic review should include not only financial outcomes, but behavioral impact. Did this decision encourage responsibility? Did it unintentionally create dependency? Did it alter beneficiary expectations? Trusteeship is iterative. Each decision informs the next. Institutional humility strengthens governance. Finally, trustees should recognize that there is a moral dimension to their role. They control resources that can alter lives. They can accelerate opportunity or restrict it. That authority must be exercised without ego. Trustees are not architects of beneficiaries' futures, nor are they passive custodians. They are stewards of a structure created for defined purposes. Humility and firmness must coexist. Humility in recognizing uncertainty, firmness in maintaining boundaries. Trustees who conflate generosity with kindness often weaken structures. Trustees who conflate restraint with strength often alienate beneficiaries. The balance lies, as ever, in disciplined judgment and in remembering that authority is temporary. Trustees serve the trust, they don't embody it. When this perspective is maintained, decision-making becomes less about winning arguments and more about preserving integrity. That is the standard against which trustees are ultimately measured. Now, as we close this episode, let's make the lessons explicit. What have we learned? First, the trust law is more concerned with process than outcome. A decision may disappoint and still be defensible if it was reached properly. A decision that appears sensible can fail if the reasoning behind it was careless or incomplete. Second, that judgment under uncertainty is the core of trusteeship. Trustees are not expected to predict the future. They're expected to engage, think, and decide with sufficient understanding. Third, that inaction itself is a decision. Persistent deferral, disguised as caution, is exposure rather than protection. Fourth, that every proper decision begins with clarity about the power being exercised. Trustees must know precisely where their authority comes from and what limits attach to it. Fifth, that relevant considerations must be identified consciously and irrelevant ones excluded. Fear of complaint, desire for harmony, or personal sympathy may be understandable, but they are not fiduciary reasons. Sixth, that advice informs judgment but never replaces it. Trustees cannot outsource discretion. Seventh, that discretion is constrained choice, not freedom. Formulaic equality or habitual refusal are often signs that discretion is not truly being exercised. Eighth, that group decision-making does not dilute individual duty. Each trustee must engage independently. Ninth, that psychological bias is real. Anchoring, familiarity, escalation of commitment, and avoidance distort judgment unless recognized and managed. 10th, that time horizon matters. Decisions shape behavior over years. Trustees must think in trajectories, not transactions. 11th, that conflicts of interest and subtle influence must be disclosed and managed openly. 12th, that documentation is protection. Clear records of powers, considerations, and reasoning often prevent disputes before they escalate. 13th, that patterns matter more than isolated decisions. Unexplained inconsistency erodes trust more quickly than a single unpopular outcome. 14th, that communication should explain framework and process, not justify outcomes emotionally. 15th, that ethical courage is unavoidable. Trustees will occasionally disappoint articulate, influential, or forceful beneficiaries. And finally, that trustees are appointed to decide, not impulsively, not defensively, but deliberately, repeatedly, and with accountability. In short, we've learnt that judgment is not an occasional requirement in trusteeship. It is the job, and process remains its protection. And that was the trustee decision-making process unpacked. Join me in the next episode, number 12, where we will unpack the subject of letters of wishes and how they can be an effective soft power, but only when done properly. Until then, I am Alexander von der Felle.